This BMW engine strictly won't last 50 or 60,000 miles. That's right, BMW's S85 engine, 507 brake horsepower. It also has an SMG gearbox, which is another source of big problems with these vehicles. From 2006 to 2010, this engine was found in the BMW M5, it was found in the M6 with a bangle butt generation, but it had a whole host of problems. Vanos systems, throttle actuators had plastic gears that would strip out and then they burn, and then all of a sudden a check engine light, coolant leaks, oil leaks from a lot of parts and replacement components that are no longer available, meaning a lot of these you cannot fix. At the bottom you have a crankshaft, and the crankshaft drives, of course, your connecting rods. In between there's a rod bearing, it's a sleeve bearing, and those bearings are known for catastrophic failure because they were too tight from the factory. Too tight, too much heat, particulate would wind up in the oil, which you could search, by the way, with Blackstone testing. They would fail regardless. A little overzealous revving when the engine was cold, and even if you did all the right maintenance, quite often the shearing forces against the oil would take that engine out catastrophically. 50,000, 60,000 miles all day long. So unless you put a rod bearing replacement on your regular maintenance program, that engine was going to fail, resulting in a catastrophic, because that crankshaft, you couldn't get a new one. If you took out the bearings, you probably took out the crankshaft, and you likely had to just throw out the engine completely. If for some reason you got ahead of it, you didn't wear out the crank, and you managed to just get the bearings swapped out, that just became something you had to do every 40 or 50,000 miles just to get ahead of the program. The engines weren't built to last, parts are becoming obsolete, and catastrophic failures are plentiful. The BMW S85 V10 engine is one of those definitely that you have to avoid if you don't have the patience and you don't have the deep wallets.
Life's too short to drive boring cars.
Here's the next vehicle you definitely don't want to touch with a 182-foot pole. I can't even imagine a clown want to ride around in this thing. This thing is absolutely horrific. It looks like the small version of an Escape, but it's kind of a half car, really, because this one here is loaded with problems. Other than the small size, which makes it almost annoying to ride around in, the transmission lurching and juddering. And way back in 2018 to 22, EcoSports with that 1-liter engine under the hood, we're talking about defective oil drive belt tensioner, and that, of course, could yield a major catastrophic failure. The big problem is, of course, the oil pump failure. A lot of these oil pumps, they say, were wet belts and they were driven within oil, but they just didn't last. Usually most pumps are driven by gear system. What's wrong with using something that works? 2019 to 2021 engines actually had major seizures, high volumes of seizures, for a matter of fact. This vehicle here has been sitting for a long time, not just because it's gone through a barrage of goods and bads and uglies. This vehicle clearly has seen its better days, but the point is they probably drove the wheels off it because they just didn't care anymore. The engines were not great in these. The space was even worse. EcoBoosts have never had a great reputation, but the 1-liter EcoBoost engines were an absolute nightmare for Ford. Another car with one of the worst engines that won't last 50 or 60,000 miles happens to be the M96 engine that you're going to find in a lot of the 996 and Boxster cars of the early generations. 99 to about 2003, you're going to find some of those engines. Now, while they're fun, and there was a whole new change for Porsche, giving up the air-cooled cars, they came with their first integrated dry sump system called the M96 engine. There were way too many problems to even list, some of which, of course, were the infamous IMS bearing problem. The IMS bearing could catastrophically fail. Now, while many vendors say that there are some replacements and there's some retrofits, like a dual row bearing or like an oil-fed bearing system or even like a ceramic type bearing, those are improved, but it's an overall engineering exercise that wasn't necessarily the best in my own personal opinion. It helps longevity, but it doesn't fix it. On top of the IMS rear main seal, and all kinds of leaks are common for these engines. Mixing, I mean coolant and oil, all of a sudden it starts to rot away all kinds of the rubbers and gaskets. But unfortunately, mixing was a big problem because of the air and oil separator, which is buried way down in there, which you can't fix, you can't reach it. It costs you probably 20 hours of labor to replace it. Either that or just replace or drop the engine altogether was the only solution. The air and oil separator was an expensive maintenance item, and it was built like it was made at the dollar store. It was so cheaply designed. The M96 engine, while it provides good value today to get into a 911, there are some major inherent problems. Cracked cylinder heads, not an uncommon phenomenon when you're dealing with a lot of these engines that would maybe overheat, or you have a water pump problem. Next thing you know, you have a catastrophic failure because of a cracked engine head. Now you have oil and coolant mixing. The initial early generation cars had a 5-chain system. You had way too many problems with chain tensioner issues. Guide ramps, those would fail as well. And just when you thought you got out of it, 2001, they improved on the design of the IMS, and they knocked it down to a 3-chain system and simplified things. Then all of a sudden you introduced a new problem. The M96 engine started developing bore score issues. Now all of a sudden you have scoring in the cylinder walls and all kinds of low compression issues, oil consumption thumbprint problems as a result of that. Many of these engines just did not last very long, and sadly there's many of these available in the used car market in a state of disarray because people always trying to part out and rebuild what they've got. Because back in the day, Porsche didn't even want to rebuild these. Many of these engines, they just considered them modular, and they would swap the entire engine in kind because there's way too many potential failure modes in these engines. It's not one of their best pieces, and even the early generation of the 997 was just about as bad. While some people of the 997 said, oh, that's a vastly improved car, it also has much of the same problems, some of the IMS issues, a derivative of the M96, and it wasn't perfect either. So this engine was one of those that wouldn't last, and certainly one that you'd have to think twice about. Right there is one of the next most problematic engines, and some of the vehicles you'll find them in. A lot of General Motors. This one here is a first generation GMC Acadia. This one does carry the 3.6 liter V6 engine, but more specifically, we're dealing with an all-wheel drive system, and that made these things practical. They seem to fit the bill for utility. The quality was just not there on the early generations 3.6. Things got a little better with age, but we all know that the 3.6 liter is one of the worst engines that General Motors has ever put out. Anything older than about 2016, and many of these early generation of the 3.6 had problems with timing chains, and the timing chains are essentially what runs the synchronization between your valves and your pistons. Without that proper synchronization, first of all, engines won't run properly. Second of all, if it happens suddenly, which sometimes they did because the chains would stretch and it'd kick out of sync, and next thing you know, catastrophic, boom, engine failure. P0011, P0014, P0021, P0024 as well, or other camshaft related position sensor problems. And so usually that was an issue of a synchronization issue, and because the chains got simply too loose. But oil consumption, carbon fouling, leaks from just about everywhere. Leaking valve cover gaskets are common issues with some of these vehicles. Oil can drip down onto the alternator, causing the alternator to fail sometimes. Battery issues, replacements, and even transmission issues. The 6-speed automatic transmission that's bolted up this problematic V6 had what they called a 35R clutch plate issue, leading to problems like slipping, harsh shifting, and even a loss of reverse gear. There's also brake issues, air conditioning problems, electric problems all the way across from electrics inside. All in all, that 3.6 was a real problematic engine. They did get better with age and with newer generations, but it wasn't a great unit. Now, the latest generation of these vehicles are using a turbocharged 4-cylinder engine, but ultimately, we all know that some of these engines had major problems. Another one of the worst engines that BMW really couldn't seem to get to fix. If you had an early generation, first generation BMW N63, that's a twin turbo 4.4 liter V8. It had a hot V, didn't have enough shielding, and a lot of the engine would typically melt down. How did you know which engine was the bad one? It was from about 2008 to about 2013, and anything with the designation 5.0 like that. 5.0 means that's their larger engines, their V8s. It's that 50 series generation that you'd find in 5 series, 6 series, 7 series, X5s, X6s. Just about every larger vehicle had that twin turbo V8 as an option. The X5 had some of the best engines and some of the worst engines. Some of their new inline 4-6-cylinder B58 engines are some of the best, but now we have some of the worst as well. First generation N63 had issues with overheating because of the hot V. So those turbos sit in the hot V, they cooked the valve guide, so valve guide seal wear, accelerated the oil consumption. You are now within that 1,000 kilometers per quart, way beyond the norm. Unfortunately, timing chains would pile up, fuel injectors were issues, premature battery draw because the vehicle sat simply too long, and any of these early generation, first generation of N63 engines were a huge problem. BMW even had to come out with sort of a customer care package which would allow them to monitor the oil consumption. But the reality was there was no real strong fix, and owners of that first generation N63 quite often just found themselves out of luck with this engine that was continually deteriorating. And it was their first kick at the cat with a V8 and twin turbocharging that BMW finally created 1 generation, 2 generation upgrades. And by the last generation, many of the modern day N63s that you're finding are much better and much improved. They have better shielding, they have better bottom end, better fuel system, and they're just a better, stronger, more powerful engine that is more reliable. But they're always going to be an expensive vehicle to maintain. There was really no way to figure out the problems. There was really no way aside from spending tens of thousands of dollars to make that engine right. They were always going to burn oil. A lot of them catastrophically failed early because of that timing chain, arguably one of BMW's very worst. Oh, what am I fooling? I'm not stopping at 5. There's actually a few more I've got for you lined up. Here's the next one with one of the worst engines, Renesis by Mazda. Now, Mazda is suggesting within the next year or two, you might actually actually see a brand new rotary powered Mazda sports car coming to the market. They're not really identifying exactly what it's going to be called yet, but there's a high probability that Mazda is going to be bringing back some kind of moderation or variation of this engine. It's basically a twin rotor Renesis engine. They just didn't last. They look cool. They've got great flares and they've got those rear doors that flip up forwards. They definitely have some cool styling, aftermarket looking taillights on this little Mazda RX-8 that you're definitely going to want to stay away from. These engines were horrid. I had an old RX-7 from back in '88. Those were pretty good. These actually don't last for more than 30, 40, 50,000 miles before you start burning oil, losing compression. Next thing you know, you've seen carbon out the backside. It doesn't want to start. It cranks, no fire. Why? Because the compression's low, because the apex seals on the tip of each one of those triangles is where they make compression, and that compression disappears. It does it in very short order. Unfortunately, the Renesis engine from this generation of Mazda RX-8, definitely one of the worst engines, and there's really no fixing it. You might fix it, rebuild the engine, and it's good for another 30, 40,000, and then you're back to square one. The Mazda with the Renesis engine and the RX-8, forget about it. Here's another one that makes my list of some of the worst engines you could possibly imagine. A lot of people say, no, there's no way Subaru could have bad engines. And obviously with turbocharged engines, they're a little bit more robust. The EJ25 you might find in late 90s, of course, early 2000s, are slightly more robust. But a lot of these flat fours engines did not have a lot of reputation for durability. The EJ25 is the most unreliable engine that they've likely ever put together. And the EJ255 is also a fairly unreliable vehicle, particularly when a lot of people start modifying them. A lot of these Subarus had all kinds of great performance attributes. They have the great all-wheel drive system a lot of people loved, and a lot of people love the wagons like this. Now here we have a repo because somebody couldn't afford to make their payments, a Subaru Outback 2.5 XT. And as I've said, it's that 2.5 liter flat four that is a problem for many of these engines. Head gasket failures are some of the more common problems in the late 90s and early 2000s, as well as oil leaks. You get all kinds of oil leaks going on all over the place. Piston damage, particularly on turbocharged engines on the EJ255 and the 257 engines, you could pop holes in pistons. A lot of people got overzealous, started modifying them, putting too much boost to these engines, and then they start blowing apart. Coolant leaks are not uncommon from almost every single gasket and hose. Now, while some of them are easy to fix and some of them aren't all that expensive, leaks, and more leaks. Piston leaks, compression leaks, and from my experience, I even had a buddy who had one of these a few bunch of years ago, and they even blew an engine trying to accelerate up a hill in the mountains. The engines, from my perspective, are not all that well built, and even with Subaru making the list of some of the most reliable, I really have to question those statistics. Well, they're kind of fun, and the low center of gravity with the flat fours always make them kind of interesting. Some of those late 90s and early 2000s just didn't quite hit the mark. Newer engines are a lot better these days, but that older EJ25 is definitely one that wasn't well made, and you constantly find yourself fixing leaks, broken parts, piston issues. Most of the engines simply do not last. We heard lots about GMC and unfortunately their new 6.2 liter V8 engine. This is a Denali, so this one's dressed right to the nines, but the problem is there's a whole pile of issues with this 6.2 liter V8 engine. A nicely spec'd out vehicle, you get rear sliders and big wheels, but the problem is with all of that bling and goodness, it just doesn't have the staying power, because on top of bad transmissions, there's also issues with the fuel modules that some say that they only go 10,000 miles on the gas trucks, some say on the diesel trucks they're only good for maybe 15,000 miles, and there's no real fix. All they do is continually replace these modules, module after module, when the vehicle stops running. On top of it, the bigger problem are the engine, which we're talking about the L87 engine in the latest generation. We're talking about 750,000 units recalled because of catastrophic engine failures. Due to what? Catastrophic rod bearing failures, crankshaft ground down out of tolerance. You're talking about the manufacturer now allegedly looking at doing deviation tests to make sure that they can monitor in advance. And for those engines that haven't failed yet, they're looking at maybe saying upping the weight of the oil. They're trying just about anything. It's almost a swing and a miss and just a shot in the dark as to try to manage failure rates of these vehicles. But what happens once a warranty's gone? What happens when even that 10 years is gone and maybe you're Grandpa Jones and you don't put a lot of miles on your truck and finally it catches up with you? You're SOL. The L87 6.2 and the late model GMs, not good. And there's a next vehicle with some of the worst engine issues that you're going to find across the board, with almost 1.7 million units recalled between a 2 liter and a 2.4 liter Theta II engine in some of these vehicles. Here we have a Kia Sportage, and you're going to find it with Kia as well as Hyundai, and it affects a lot of vehicles, from the Hyundai Sonata 2011 to 12, Hyundai Santa Fe 2010 to 2012, Hyundai Tucson 2010 to 2013 with the 2.4 Theta II MPI engine, the Kia Optima 2011 to 2016 with the Theta II, as well as the Kia Sorento and the Kia Sportage 2011 to 2013 with the Theta II 2.4 MPI, all part of this major recall of almost 2 million, or at least 1.7 million units, where there's catastrophic engine failures. The worst part is all they could could do was put an extension on the warranty to get people to 10 years, and people feel that that's good enough for me. But what they don't realize is ones that didn't fail started to resort to weird engine knockings and noises, because quite often a lot of the problems was in the machining process. Some of the particulate would actually wind up going through the oil passages, plug off oil passages. The entire engine gets lubricated by the oil. But if some of those oiling surfaces actually plug off, which a lot of them were, it starves it out, you get a hot spot, and all of a sudden premature failure. There was many rod bearings catastrophically failing as a result of some of these issues, and many people thought, okay, I have 20,000, I'm good. I have 40,000, I'm good. Sometimes it would happen at 30,000, 40,000 miles. Sometimes it would happen at 150,000 miles, but it almost always happened, and the vast majority of these vehicles sustained some level of failure. A lot of the metals wound up in the orifices, resulting in some level of deterioration or catastrophic failure. Not to mention a lot of the other engines that we've heard of sustained other problems because it's direct injected. You have excess carbon fouling. The rings that control the oil, that keep the oil at the bottom of the engine, they would stop scraping properly. You get too much carbon buildup because of the MPI, and next thing you know, you had broken rings and bore scoring and heavy oil consumption. Transmission issues, or some of the electrics, or the fact that some vehicles within certain model years had potential for catastrophically burning due to the ABS controller flooding out by brake fluid that could itself start a fire. These cars, in my opinion, were some of the worst vehicles in history, and with the Theta II engine recalls, almost 1.7 million customers are constantly looking over their shoulders if they aren't in fact already waiting for a replacement engine. And if you want a more comprehensive list of some of the worst engines, check out that playlist. You're gonna love it. Going to take you through almost everything in the market. Hope to see each and every one in the next one, everybody. See you real soon. Bye-bye.